So what happens next in the Israel-Iran war? What are Iran's options now? What will America do next? Joining me now, a very special guest. Pleased to be joined by Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He joins me from Washington, D.C., widely considered one of the authorities on Iran because he's a former president also of the National Iranian-American Council. Appreciate your joining us, Mr. Parsi, there from Washington, D.C. Give us a sense of what you believe is the state of play, if I may use that word, at the moment, given the fact that American officials are now claiming that Iran could retaliate in a day or two. Do you believe that this regime will fight to the end, or will it seek a peace deal after the U.S. strikes on nuclear sites in Iran?
I think it is far more likely that the Iranians will fight back. And I also believe that they have an impression, right or wrong, that they simply cannot trust the Trump administration, mindful of the deception that he has engaged in. And as a result, even if they wanted to or believe they had to give up or surrender, they would not trust a surrender offer from Trump. And this is part of the counterproductive elements or consequences of the manner in which Trump has handled this. But I also want to emphasize, I'm not getting the impression at all that the Iranians are even contemplating surrender at this point.
It's interesting you're saying that, because the narrative, particularly from the Western media, is that Iran is running out of options. Israel continues to bomb Iranian sites. The Americans have got into the war, and therefore Iran is getting more and more isolated. You don't go along with that, that this regime is getting more and more isolated with fewer and fewer options, Trita?
I do believe that there is truth in that, in the sense that the Iranians are in a difficult situation. The United States has entered the war, which is a major victory for Israel, who from the outset had tried to do something to bring the US and Iran into war with each other. And that, of course, Iran does not have the type of defense arrangements with Russia, China, or any other country to actually get any help. However, having said that, there's also a more full picture that shows the Iranians are still striking back at the Israelis. They have not even touched their medium and short range arsenal of missiles that could strike at American bases in the region that are much closer to Iran than Israel's territory is. And that the Iranians may calculate as well that they can sustain a long, protracted fight in a manner that Israel or the United States cannot. Trump has difficulties with his own base, who are dead set against him getting into new wars. They elected him to avoid new wars. The Israelis cannot sustain a long fight unless the US is in on it. This is part of the reason why they put so much effort into getting the US into that war immediately after they started it. So I think the picture is more complicated than that, but it is absolutely true that the Iranians have taken some very, very significant hits. They have bad options in front of them in many different ways, but to present this as some sort of clean-cut victory for the US or for Israel is most likely war propaganda, as well as I'm sure there's plenty of things coming out of the Iranian state media that it should fall under the category of propaganda rather than truth.
You said long and protracted conflict is something the Iranians may be ready for. But what are their realistic options? There's been talk about Iran trying to close the Straits of Hormuz. Perhaps that would have an impact on oil, bring in other countries into the fold. Do they then turn to the Russians, as they have today, to possibly mediate? Do they strike back, as you seem to suggest, with their missile capability? Do they target American bases? What is a realistic option in the short term, Trita, that you see that Tehran really has?
I think striking at US bases is probably the most likely scenario in this situation. I don't think they're going to go that far up on the escalation ladder to completely close off the Strait of Hormuz. That would create problems for themselves. It would create problems for China and others. But I can see them slowly increasing insecurity in the Strait of Hormuz, particularly for Western ships or Western aligned ships. So there's plenty of options. This is not a 0-to-1 situation. There's other things that they probably are looking at. The question is, can either side actually say that a protracted or even a short war ultimately is a win for them? In my view, this is a complete lose-lose proposition between the United States and Iran. both of them would be faring much better if they shifted back to genuine diplomacy. But genuine diplomacy cannot occur unless, or at least it cannot be successful, unless Trump shifts back to the American red line of no weaponization, which was his original red line, before he changed the goalpost halfway through the negotiations and adopted the Israeli red line of zero enrichment. If he sticks to zero enrichment, I think that unfortunately the risk of continued confrontation is much higher than a diplomatic deal.
But there is another red line which seems to be emerging, or certainly another goal, if I may say so, which is regime change. We've heard the US president in a social media post say, why can't there be regime change? Is there a distinction between regime change and the hope of a regime collapse? Is that what US and Israel is really hoping for now at this stage, that perhaps forces within Iran revolt against the regime? Is that now the new goal?
It has been the goal of the Israelis, I believe, from the outset. And we have seen that over the course of the last couple of weeks, Israel has been much more in command of the situation. And Trump has consistently conceded to the Israelis and adopted their positions and reacted to their policies rather than being in charge himself. And the Israelis have been looking for regime collapse from the outset, in my estimation. And I think it's very important, the distinction you're making between regime collapse and regime change. Regime change is what happened in 2003. The United States illegally invaded Iraq, changed the government, and installed a new government. That's not what the Israelis are looking for. They're not looking to install a new government because that would require most likely ground troops and a ground invasion. They're looking for regime collapse, which means that the current state collapses, but nothing replaces it. And then they let the chaos fester, whether it's civil war, ethnic divisions and separatism, but something that essentially consumes Iran internally, its own power internally, rather than enabling it to be able to project force outwardly. And this, I think, would be a disaster for the region and, of course, for Iran and its territorial integrity. But that is a less costly approach than regime change that would require ground troops. And then Israel or the United States would be responsible for what happens in Iran afterwards. Whereas with the regime collapse approach, they're essentially washing their hands and taking no responsibility for what happens afterwards.
But how likely is regime collapse, given the fact that here is an Iranian leadership that has stayed the course for almost 5 decades, survived all the ups and downs over these years? Is it, in your view, a regime which is in serious decline? And are there visible alternatives available there if there is regime collapse, or will chaos and more uncertainty ensue?
I think chaos is much more likely to be the result if there is regime collapse. Second to that is that another element within the same regime takes over power, meaning that it's not going to be, the son of the previous Shah or some peaceful NGOs that will take over the country, but rather some of the more aggressive elements from within the regime will do a coup and take over the system as a whole. Those are more likely scenarios that I think than seeing democratization or anything like that coming out of a regime change or regime collapse policy through war. It would be different if this had happened in a completely different context.
But we are seeing a more unstable Middle East as a result. And will we, along with that instability, also see the gradual dominance of Israel? Is that something that Arab regimes who are not speaking out at the moment actually fear? It's one thing for the US and Israel to hope for regime change or regime collapse, as you put it. But what about the regimes around, which have had difficult relationships with Iran? Will they be celebrating, or will they be concerned at a more and more dominant, bullying Israel?
I think that there is a lot of hesitation and concern in some of the GCC countries. Many of them clearly have no love for the current Iranian regime, but they're also realizing that they are now faced with the potential reality of not only an Israeli hegemony in the region, but a bullying and erratic Israeli hegemony in the region, in which even their relations with the United States will not provide a buffer against what the Israelis want. They've seen that the United States is essentially caving to the Israelis over and over again. And as a result, this creates a lot of concern on their end. They were not happy with Iran's power when it was at its peak, but that doesn't mean that they want to live under Israeli hegemony.